Imagine this. You're standing on a quiet plain in northern China as the sun sinks low, and the wind stirs the dust. Beneath your feet lies a city long asleep. Not a city of marble arches or stone pyramids, but a city of packed earth, bronze workshops, and echoing courtyard. For a long time, people thought this world was only a legend. Then the ground began to speak. Archaeologists brushed away the soil and found bones etched with tiny marks. Not monsters or myths, but questions. Real questions asked by real people. Will the rains come? Will the hunt bring food? Will the king's child grow strong? These were carved into the smooth underside of turtle shells and cattle bones, then heated until they cracked. The cracks were read like a whisper from the unseen, a way to make sense of uncertainty. And just like that, a legend stepped into history. We call this world the Shang Dynasty, a realm that rose more than 3,000 years before Christ along the Yellow River, a place where writing, ritual, and power took root together. Picture the capital at Yinshu, broad avenues, timber halls, and a rhythm that never stops. Smiths pour glowing bronze into clay molds, shaping heavy ritual vessels that look almost alive, decorated with curling beasts and hidden faces. You can smell the smoke of the foundries, hear the clink of tools, the beat of drums, the murmur of scribes. Nearby, a chariot rattles over the packed earth, wheels ringed with bronze. Horses snort, leather harness creaks, and the driver's hands are steady. This was not a distant fairy tale. It was a working, pulsing city that linked farms and forests, craft and ceremony, memory and hope. What I love most about the Shang is that they left a diary written in fire. Those cracked bones speak across more than 3,000 years. They tell us when the moon blotted the sun. They list the names of rulers and their kin. They count the harvests and record illnesses, victories, and doubts. They even note the rhythm of the seasons, how a king might worry about floods or seek guidance before a journey. It's not just power on display, it's the everyday heart of a society trying to understand its place in the world. And yet, authority here felt different from the way we usually imagine kings. The ruler was not just a warrior or a judge. He stood as a bridge between the living and those who came before. Ancestors were not gone. They were present, listening. Rituals bound the court together, tying the fate of the people to the goodwill of the unseen. Those heavy bronze vessels were not ornaments. They were invitations to memory, raised in solemn gatherings to honor the chain that linked grandparents to grandchildren, field to hearth, river to sky. There's a tenderness tucked inside this story, too, even in a world we often describe with iron and fire. On one set of bones, a king wonders if his child will get well. On another, someone asks if the hunt will bring relief to a hungry season. Behind the grandeur of palaces and processions, you can sense a steady hum of worry, love, and duty. The past was a companion, not a burden, and the future was a question they tried to answer with care. Of course, the Shang knew struggle. Neighbors challenged them. Rivers swelled and changed course. Leadership shifted, but their answer was always to make something lasting. They refined bronze casting until they could create pieces so complex that later craftsmen studied them for centuries. They shaped the earliest Chinese characters in ways so clear that you can still trace their family lines in modern writing. They built chariots that could move with speed and surety across the plains, and trained teams who understood how to turn that speed into command. When the dynasty's strength finally waned in the 11th century before Christ, another house rose and told a story to explain it, that heaven had lent its favor and then taken it away. Maybe it was rebellion, maybe it was drought, or the slow wearing down that comes to every power. What remains beyond any single cause is the imprint of a people who learned to translate uncertainty into words, clay, and metal, and who believed that the living and the departed could share a table. So next time you think of ancient China, don't start with stone walls or buried armies. Start with a small mark cut into bone by someone with steady hands and a clear question. Start with a vessel raised carefully to catch the light of a fire. Start with a city that once hummed with wheels, bells, and breath. From these small, careful acts, a civilization wrote itself into time. If you love history as much as we do, take a moment to like this video, share it with a friend who enjoys these journeys, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. There are so many more voices waiting under the soil, and we would love to uncover them with you. Picture this. Somewhere along the muddy banks of the Yellow River around 3,600 years ago, something extraordinary was happening. While most of the ancient world was still figuring out how to work with basic metals, a group of people in what we now call China were doing something that would change everything. You know how sometimes archaeologists make discoveries that completely rewrite history books? Well, that's exactly what happened with the Shang Dynasty. For the longest time, historians thought the Shang were just another collection of myths and legends, like King Arthur or Atlantis. Ancient Chinese texts mentioned them, sure, but where was the proof? Then, in the early 1900s, farmers near the modern city of Anyang kept finding strange bones in their fields. These weren't ordinary animal bones, though. They were covered in what looked like primitive writing, and locals had been grinding them up for traditional medicine, calling them dragon bones. Can you imagine? They were literally crushing pieces of history into powder. But here's where it gets fascinating. When scholars finally got their hands on these bones and started deciphering the symbols, they realized they were looking at something incredible: the earliest known Chinese writing system. And these weren't just random scratches either. These were questions. Questions carved into turtle shells and ox shoulder blades, then heated until they cracked. The ancient Shang were essentially having conversations with their ancestors and gods through these oracle bones. What really blew everyone's minds was when archaeologists started digging where these bones were found. They uncovered Yinshu, which turned out to be one of the most sophisticated ancient cities anyone had ever seen. We're talking about a place that covered over 30 square kilometers, with massive palace foundations, elaborate royal tombs, and workshops where craftsmen created bronze artifacts so beautiful and complex that even today we're not entirely sure how they managed it. The city itself tells such a human story. You can almost picture daily life there, the constant hammering from bronze workshops, the smoke rising from ritual fires, merchants haggling in bustling markets. But Yinshu also revealed something darker about Shang society. The royal tombs contained evidence of human sacrifice on a scale that's hard to comprehend. When a king died, hundreds of people might be buried with him, from servants to guards to horses and chariots, all meant to serve him in the afterlife. What makes this discovery so remarkable isn't just that it proved the Shang Dynasty really existed. It's that it showed us China's first historically verified civilization was far more advanced than anyone had imagined. These people had organized armies, complex religious systems, sophisticated art, and a writing system that would eventually evolve into modern Chinese characters. The Shang didn't just emerge from nowhere either. They built upon whatever came before them, possibly including the legendary Zhou Dynasty, and created something entirely new. They were master bronze workers at a time when most of the world was still in the Stone Age. They developed wheeled chariots and used them in warfare with devastating effectiveness. They created urban centers that coordinated activities across vast territories. But perhaps most amazingly, through those oracle bones, we can actually hear their voices across thousands of years. We know what they worried about, what they hoped for, what questions kept their kings awake at night. They asked about harvests, about wars, about whether their children would be healthy. In many ways, they sound remarkably like us. Imagine being so desperate to know what tomorrow holds that you're willing to crack bones to find out. That's exactly what the Shang people did, and it's one of the most fascinating communication systems the ancient world ever developed. Picture a Shang king 3,000 years before Christ, sitting in his palace as dawn breaks over the Yellow River Valley. He's got big decisions to make today. Should he send his army north to fight those troublesome tribes? Will the rains come in time to save this year's harvest? Is his newborn son healthy enough to survive the coming winter? These aren't just casual worries. In the ancient world, making the wrong choice could mean the difference between a thriving kingdom and complete disaster. But here's the incredible part. The Shang didn't just guess. They had developed an elaborate system to actually ask their ancestors and gods for guidance. They would take the shoulder blade of an ox or the underside of a turtle shell. These became known as oracle bones, and carefully carve their questions into the surface, using the earliest form of Chinese writing we know about. The process itself was almost like a sacred ritual. The king or his diviners would heat these bones with red-hot bronze rods until the bone cracked from the temperature change. Then they would study the pattern of cracks like we might read tea leaves, interpreting the lines and splits as answers from the divine realm. Finally, they would carve the results right there on the bone, creating a permanent record of both the question and the supposed answer. What's absolutely mind-blowing is just how many of these conversations with the gods have survived. Archaeologists have uncovered over 150,000 oracle bones, and each one is like reading someone's diary from 3,500 years ago. We can see exactly what kept these ancient rulers awake at night, what they celebrated, what they feared most. Some of these questions are surprisingly personal and relatable. Will the queen give birth safely? Is my toothache a sign of something serious? Should I trust this new advisor? Others show the weight of leadership. Will our enemies attack before the harvest? Should we move the capital to higher ground? How many prisoners should we offer to ensure the ancestors' favor? But here's where it gets really incredible. Some of these oracle bones contain predictions that were startlingly accurate. We found records where Shang diviners predicted solar eclipses, floods, and droughts with remarkable precision. Now, we know today that they probably based these predictions on careful observation of natural patterns rather than divine inspiration. But imagine how this must have seemed to people at the time. Their king could literally predict when the sun would disappear from the sky. The writing system they used on these bones is absolutely fascinating, too. You can actually see how Chinese characters evolved from these early pictographs. The symbol for rain looks like drops falling from clouds. The character for tree resembles a trunk with branches. The word for king shows a person standing prominently among others. It's like watching the birth of written communication in real time. What makes these oracle bones so special isn't just their age, it's how intimate and human they are. Through them, we get to witness the fears, hopes, and daily struggles of people who lived thousands of years ago. A king worried about his sick child sounds remarkably similar to any parent today rushing to the doctor. A ruler concerned about whether to go to war faced the same impossible choices that leaders still grapple with. The Shang took this communication with the divine world so seriously that they kept detailed records. They didn't just ask questions and forget about them. They tracked whether their interpretations came true, almost like they were fine-tuning their system over generations. Some oracle bones even show corrections or additional notes added later, suggesting they were constantly trying to improve their accuracy. And if you're finding yourself as fascinated by this ancient legacy as many of us are, you're definitely not alone. Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. There's something captivating about discovering that our ancestors from thousands of years ago were asking the same fundamental questions we ask today, just using very different methods to find answers. These oracle bones represent one of humanity's earliest attempts to peer into the future and make sense of an uncertain world, something we're still trying to do in our own ways today. Picture this. It's around 1,500 years before Christ, and across the ancient world, most armies are still fighting with stone weapons and wooden clubs. But in the Yellow River Valley of China, something revolutionary is happening. The Shang have discovered something that would change warfare forever: bronze. Now, bronze might not sound that impressive today, but imagine being a neighboring tribe armed with stone axes when you suddenly face soldiers carrying gleaming bronze spears, axes, and arrowheads that could slice through anything you had. It wasn't just about having better weapons, though. The Shang had turned warfare into an art form. The heart of their military power wasn't just bronze, it was the horse-drawn chariot. These weren't the heavy, clunky carts you might picture. Shang chariots were lightweight, fast, and terrifying to face in battle. Each one carried a team of 3, a driver, an archer, and a spearman. They could race across the battlefield, rain down arrows, and disappear before their enemies could react. For armies that had never seen anything move that fast, it must have seemed like the gods themselves were attacking. But what really made the Shang military machine so effective was how organized everything was. They didn't just throw soldiers together and hope for the best. Archaeological evidence shows they had a complex command structure, standardized weapons, and coordinated tactics. When a Shang army marched to war, it was like a well-oiled machine designed for one purpose: victory. Here's where the story takes a more complex turn, because the Shang approach to power involved practices that are difficult for us to understand today. They believed deeply that their kings were not just political leaders, but sacred intermediaries between the human world and the realm of ancestors and gods. This belief system led to practices that were integral to their society, including ritual offerings that sometimes involved human lives. When a Shang king died, the belief was that he needed to continue ruling in the afterlife, just as he had in life. This meant he would need his servants, his guards, his charioteers, and even his horses to serve him in the next world. Archaeological excavations of royal tombs reveal the profound extent of these beliefs. Entire retinues were buried with their rulers, from personal attendants to military officers. What's particularly striking about these discoveries is how they reveal the Shang worldview. They saw death not as an ending, but as a transition to another form of existence, where the same social structures and relationships would continue. The king would still need protection, still need advice, still need people to drive his chariots and care for his horses. These practices weren't random or cruel in the Shang mindset. They were deeply religious acts that they believed were necessary to maintain the cosmic order. The king's power in this life and the next was seen as essential for the prosperity and protection of the entire kingdom. If the ancestors weren't properly served, the living might face disasters, failed harvests, or defeat in war. The scale of these burials tells us something important about Shang society, too. Only a civilization with significant resources and strong central authority could organize such elaborate funeral rites. It shows us a society where the king's authority was so absolute and so sacred that people would willingly participate in these final ceremonies. But the Shang war machine wasn't built on fear alone. They were also master diplomats and administrators. They understood that lasting power came not just from the ability to conquer, but from the ability to govern effectively. They established a network of city-states, each ruled by relatives or trusted nobles who answered directly to the king. They created trade networks that brought in resources from across ancient China. They developed systems for collecting taxes, organizing labor, and maintaining their bronze-working industry. What's fascinating is how all of these elements worked together. The bronze weapons required skilled craftsmen and steady supplies of copper and tin. The chariots needed trained horses and experienced drivers. The military campaigns needed careful planning and substantial resources. The religious ceremonies required priests who understood the complex rituals. It was an interconnected system where military might, technological innovation, religious authority, and political organization all supported each other. This integration of sacred and secular power made the Shang incredibly effective rulers for over 500 years. Their kings weren't just generals, they were warrior priests who claimed direct communication with the ancestors. This gave them a legitimacy that went far beyond mere military strength, even as that strength remained the foundation of their authority. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. While most ancient civilizations were still figuring out basic metalworking, the Shang were creating bronze masterpieces so sophisticated that modern artisans struggle to understand how they did it. We're talking about vessels and sculptures that were not just functional objects, but works of art that would make any museum curator weep with joy. Picture walking into a Shang royal palace around 1400 years before Christ. The first thing that would catch your eye wouldn't be gold or precious stones. It would be bronze. Bronze everywhere, gleaming in the firelight, each piece more intricate than the last. But these weren't just decorative objects sitting around looking pretty. Every single bronze vessel had a purpose, and most of them were designed for one of the most important activities in Shang society, communicating with the ancestors. The Shang believed that their deceased relatives and ancient kings continued to exist in a parallel world, one that closely mirrored their own. These ancestors weren't distant memories. They were active participants in daily life who needed to be fed, honored, and consulted regularly. This is where those incredible bronze vessels came in. They were essentially the dinner service for the dead. But calling them dinner service really doesn't do justice to what we're talking about here. Imagine a wine cup so perfectly balanced that it feels alive in your hands, decorated with intricate patterns of dragons and mythical creatures that seem to dance around the surface. Picture massive ceremonial cauldrons, some weighing over 800 pounds, covered in designs so complex they tell entire stories. These weren't just containers, they were masterworks of engineering and artistry. What makes these bronze pieces even more remarkable is the technical skill required to create them. The Shang developed a sophisticated casting process using clay molds that allowed them to create vessels with incredibly thin walls and elaborate decorative elements. They mastered the art of combining copper and tin in exact proportions to create bronze that was both durable and beautiful. Some of their larger pieces required coordinating teams of dozens of craftsmen working in perfect synchronization. But here's where the story gets really exciting. It was on these very bronze vessels that Chinese writing began to evolve beyond the oracle bones. As the Shang bronze workers became more skilled, they started inscribing longer texts directly into their creations. These weren't just the names of owners or simple dedications. We're talking about detailed records of ceremonies, family histories, and even political agreements cast permanently in bronze. Think about what this means. Every time a Shang noble commissioned a new ritual vessel, they weren't just getting a beautiful object. They were creating a permanent record that would last for thousands of years. These bronze inscriptions became some of the earliest books in human history, except instead of paper, they were written in metal. The writing itself was undergoing a fascinating transformation during this period. What started as simple pictographs on oracle bones was becoming more abstract and stylized on bronze. You can actually trace the evolution of individual Chinese characters by comparing how they appear on bones versus how they're rendered on bronze vessels from different periods. It's like watching language itself grow and mature. What's particularly touching about many of these inscriptions is how personal they are. A father commissioning a ceremonial wine vessel for his deceased son would have the entire story of the boy's life inscribed on the bronze, his accomplishments, his character, how much he was loved and missed. A king might have his greatest victories recorded on a massive cauldron, ensuring that future generations would remember his deeds every time they used it in ceremony. The Shang understood something profound about the relationship between art, memory, and power. They knew that beautiful objects have a way of preserving important information across generations. A bronze vessel doesn't just hold wine, it holds stories, histories, and connections to the past that remain vivid and meaningful centuries later. The artistic themes on these bronze pieces tell us so much about how the Shang saw the world. Dragons represented power and divine connection. Geometric patterns reflected their understanding of cosmic harmony. Animal motifs connected the human world to the natural realm. Every decorative element had meaning, making each vessel a complex visual language that communicated ideas about religion, politics, and philosophy. Perhaps most amazingly, the Shang managed to make these incredibly heavy, expensive, and labor-intensive objects feel intimate and personal. A ritual wine cup might weigh several pounds and be worth a fortune, but when you look at the delicate inscription naming a beloved family member, it becomes something much more than metal and art. It becomes a bridge across time, connecting us directly to the hearts and minds of people who lived over 3,000 years ago. This is where the true genius of Shang bronze work reveals itself. They didn't just create beautiful objects or practical tools. They created a way for their deepest thoughts, their most important relationships, and their most cherished memories to survive forever. In a world where most human achievements fade into dust, the the Shang found a way to cast their souls in bronze. Every great dynasty has its final chapter, and for the Shang, that chapter unfolded in 1046 years before Christ, with all the drama and tragedy of a story that seems almost too incredible to be true. But sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are exactly what really happened. Picture King Dixin, the last ruler of a dynasty that had dominated China for over 5 centuries. By all accounts, he was not the kind of king you'd want to meet at a dinner party. Ancient records describe him as brilliant but cruel, charismatic but increasingly unstable. He was said to be so strong he could bend iron bars with his bare hands, so clever he could outwit any advisor, and so ruthless that even his own nobles began to fear him. But here's the thing about power that the Shang discovered the hard way. It's not enough to be strong or smart or even feared. You also have to be legitimate. And legitimacy in ancient China came from something called the mandate of heaven. This wasn't just a political concept. It was the fundamental belief that the gods chose who got to rule, and they could just as easily take that choice away. For centuries, the Shang had claimed this divine mandate. Their oracle bones proved they could speak to the ancestors. Their military victories showed the gods favored them. Their prosperity demonstrated heavenly approval. But by Dixin's time, things were starting to fall apart in ways that made people wonder if heaven was having second thoughts. The kingdom was facing serious problems. There were natural disasters, floods, droughts, failed harvests that left people hungry and questioning whether their king still had divine favor. The constant military campaigns that had once brought glory and wealth were now draining resources and creating enemies faster than the Shang could handle them. Noble families who had been loyal for generations were starting to grumble about Dixin's increasingly erratic behavior. This is where the Zhou enter our story. They were originally one of the Shang's vassal states, a people who had been conquered and incorporated into the Shang system decades earlier. But the Zhou had been watching, learning, and most importantly, building alliances with other groups who were unhappy with Shang rule. Their leader, King Wu, was everything Dixin wasn't: patient, diplomatic, and very good at convincing people that heaven was ready for a change of management. The Zhou didn't just challenge the Shang militarily, they challenged them ideologically. They introduced a revolutionary idea that would shape Chinese political thought for thousands of years. The mandate of heaven wasn't permanent. A dynasty could lose divine favor if its rulers became corrupt, cruel, or incompetent. When that happened, heaven would transfer its mandate to someone more worthy. It was brilliant propaganda because it gave people a moral justification for rebellion. They weren't just fighting against a powerful king, they were helping heaven correct a cosmic mistake. The final battle supposedly took place at a place called Muye, and according to Zhou records, it was over remarkably quickly. Many of Dixin's own soldiers switched sides mid-battle, convinced that heaven had indeed abandoned their king. Dixin retreated to his palace, and here's where the story becomes both tragic and symbolic. According to legend, rather than face capture, Dixin dressed himself in his finest royal robes, adorned himself with precious jade, climbed to the top of a tower in his palace, and set the whole thing on fire with himself inside. Some versions say he was so drunk on wine that he barely knew what was happening. Others suggest it was a deliberate, defiant final act. If heaven no longer wanted him as king, he would remove himself from the equation entirely. Whether this dramatic end actually happened exactly as described, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that the Zhou victory was complete and decisive. They didn't just defeat the Shang, they absorbed them, adopted their writing system, learned their bronze-working techniques, and built upon their administrative innovations while claiming that heaven had now given them the right to rule. The Zhou were smart about how they handled their victory, too. They didn't portray the Shang as evil monsters who deserved destruction. Instead, they argued that the early Shang kings had been good rulers who truly held the mandate of heaven, but that the dynasty had gradually become corrupted over time. Dixin was presented as the culmination of this decline, a ruler who had lost touch with both his people and the divine will. This narrative served the Zhou well because it established that even they could lose the mandate of heaven if they weren't careful. It created a system where political legitimacy depended not just on military strength but on moral behavior and effective governance. This concept would influence Chinese political philosophy for over 2,000 years. But here's what makes the end of the Shang so fascinating from our perspective today. We're still not entirely sure what really caused their downfall. Was it Di Xin's personal failings as a leader? Climate change that made their agricultural system unsustainable? Economic pressures from constant warfare? Social tensions between the ruling elite and ordinary people? Military innovations that gave the Zhou decisive advantages? Probably all of these factors played a role, which makes the Shang collapse a perfect case study in how complex civilizations can unravel when multiple problems hit at the same time. The Zhou explanation that heaven had withdrawn its mandate was a way of making sense of this complexity in terms that people of the time could understand. What's remarkable is how much of the Shang legacy survived their political destruction. The Zhou kept their writing system, their bronze-working techniques, their urban planning methods, and even many of their religious practices. In many ways, the Shang didn't really die. They transformed into something new, while their innovations continued to shape Chinese civilization for millennia to come. And if you find yourself as captivated by these ancient stories as many of us are, you're connecting with something timeless about the human experience. The rise and fall of dynasties, the struggle between power and responsibility, the question of what makes leadership legitimate. These are themes that still resonate today. The Shang may have ruled over 3,000 years ago, but the lessons embedded in their story continue to offer insights into the nature of power, the importance of adaptability, and the eternal challenge of building something that lasts. What lessons do you think we can draw from this ancient legacy of triumph, innovation, and ultimate transformation? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.